Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending this session today. I think this is a great follow-up to what Tim was just talking about the importance of storytelling and the importance of content. Because we feel that with content marketing, you really can create that conversation with your consumers. So this shouldn't be surprising. Content marketing is really gaining in popularity as of late. We found that 86% of marketers are adding this to their strategic approach, and then almost 50% are going to spend more in content marketing in the next 12 months. So much so that almost 3 in 4 are creating more content than they did a year ago. But we have to understand that there is a challenge in creating content. First, when we think about it from a marketer perspective, whether it's branded content or native content or branded advertising, it's still that. It's still advertising. It's still paid for. It still wants to change awareness, build perception, and of course, ultimately drive purchasing. But we have to remember, although it is advertising, for the consumer, it's still content. It's still a place for them to be engaged. They want to be informed. They want to be entertained. So the challenge here is actually creating content that works for both the marketers and for the consumers. And so we wanted to tackle this challenge head on. And to do that, we wanted to answer 3 questions. The first one being, does content marketing actually work? And if it does, how can we create best practices to make sure we're creating the content that's working for our consumers? And then even before we actually create that content, can we understand the motivations for why consumers are engaging with content in the first place? And if we can understand those motivations, can marketers actually align around them? And before we go into the challenge, I wanted to take a step back and understand the content marketing process. So I should say that this is actually from an advertiser or brand perspective, partnering with a publisher like AOL. So the first part of the process is the strategy. And that's where the brand aligns with the publisher, and that's when we start to ask the different questions. So what tone should the content take? What formats work the best? What's your target audience for all of this? And once we become better aligned, we then move into the development phase. And this is where we actually understand, okay, what type of content, what category of content do we want to align around? And we ask further questions and we really get on the same page. And once we start to establish that content, we roll out a schedule to say when are we going to distribute the different pieces of content. And naturally, the next step is it goes live. So we'll launch the content program. Consumers are starting to engage with and go towards the content. And although this is the last part of the content marketing process, this was actually where my team at AOL was really involved in the process. So the content was already created, it was already launched, but then our internal team and our advertisers wanted to know, is this actually working? Is this going to drive towards my KPI? And while we understand that this was at the end of the process, we wanted to understand, okay, is there any good measurement out there? And what we found, both in 2017 and it's been a process for the last couple of years, is that there actually is no good process out there. We see that the majority, that yellow and gray part of this pie, are actually unsure or do not know what successful content marketing campaigns looks like. And that's concerning. So we wanted to say, well, what measurement options are out there? So we can passively, and we do passively, track behaviors such as social engagements, click-through, but that really wasn't telling anything about the actual content. How was the content performing? Why was it performing a certain way? And your standard brand lift measurements, they weren't really up to the task, because even if we could tag all pieces of content, we really weren't reading that feasibility impression threshold to understand what exposed respondents were doing. So we wanted to take this into our own hands and develop a solution. So we realized that the solution was at the intersection of a copy test and a content test. And originally, when we set out to do this solution, we thought that it was going to be for a handful of programs, really just to develop case studies for our newly formed content marketing team. And so, as I said, it's really a hybrid between copy and content. So a copy test, that's measuring the message's effectiveness. Does it fit with the content? Is it driving those brand perceptions? And then a content test was more about, is the content likable? Is it too long? Is it too short? Do we like the talent that's involved in the content? Again, it's that hybrid of the two. And just because this is research, we want to talk a little bit. We used a forced exposure methodology, which really allowed us to take the pulse of our consumers any time throughout the campaign. And we believe the beauty of this solution was that it was built on an existing methodology of content and copy testing. So there was no new metric that we had to inform our consumers or our brands on. It was no black box algorithm that was super confusing. It was straightforward, it was easy to interpret, and therefore, most importantly, it was actionable for our clients. And like I mentioned, we originally set out to do this only for a few campaigns, but what's happened is since this methodology was created over 4 years ago, we've done this for over 60 programs, 300 content marketing activations, and 63,000 consumer experiences with over a variety of brands and categories. So we didn't intend to do this, but what happened was we were able to create a normative database. And this was important for us, not only for our internal stakeholders, but it's really important for our clients and for the industry because we want to know what is a successful metric for those content marketing campaigns. So let me show you what some of the insights we learned from this normative database. I will go over 3 best practices when creating content. But before we do that, like I said, we want to know, does content marketing even work? And in short, yes, we see that it does drive custom results. So we see brand affinity, interest in learning more, and the purchase consideration, that closest proxy to sales, is driven by content marketing programs. And I should mention that these percentages will, of course, change for different categories or different campaigns, but this is what we see again in our normative database. But these percentages will only work if we can create content that's really resonating with the consumer. And that's where those best practices come in. So the first one is pretty obvious. It's know your audience. We saw that 61% of consumers said that they don't mind if the content is sponsored by a brand as long as the content is good. So this is giving brands that okay to sponsor content and interact with consumers that way. And digital content is different than more traditional medias like TV or print because there's so much digital content out there. And a lot of it can be user-generated, and therefore sometimes, honestly, it's not that good. So when content is good, consumers don't mind that it's sponsored by a brand. They're not frustrated by it. Instead, it allows the brand to break through and actually build that relationship with the consumer. But it's important to know your audience past the age and gender and actually understand what's motivating them to consume that content. And sometimes content we find is just created based on gut instinct, and instead we want to actually create it with insights in mind. And we were able to do this for a well-known dog food advertiser doing some qualitative research. So they wanted to release a new dog food brand, and they wanted to understand which part of the environment in the pet food category was going to work best for them, particularly around digital video. So we surveyed current dog owners to understand what environment works best. And we found that there were 3 different environments. There's the depressing video, so this one is of a beagle being rescued and its first time on the grass. Entertaining, the Denver, the guilty snack-stealing dog. And inspiring, it's a training video between the owner and its pet. So which of these environments really worked best for a brand awareness campaign? Depressing, while important to dog owners, really wasn't the best environment. If you think about those commercials with the Sarah McLachlan video song that goes over it, I think everyone knows that very well. It's probably not where you want to align your brand. Entertaining, while great for broad reach, typically because it's very social, it really wasn't the best place, again, for brand awareness because the consumer is all about themselves in that moment. Maybe they're taking a break from work or it's after a long day, someone emailed them this funny video, so they're only thinking about themselves. But inspiring, this is where we felt was the best spot for a brand awareness campaign because a consumer was able to understand what the video was about. They were able to see themselves in the video and think about their own pet, and therefore they could relate the brand back to themselves. And so our next best practice is going to understand how to create this useful content. So we understand that the content is best on these metrics of brand recall, affinity, and interest in learning more if it's especially useful, that blue box. So again, making that content relevant to the consumer. And I should mention that, of course, this is not going to be the same across every campaign, but because we have that normative database, we can see this time and time again. And our last best practice was surprising to us and maybe counterintuitive to some publishers, even to actually our editors at the Huffington Post, was that deeper brand integration does not equal a bad consumer experience. In fact, when we broke down our data into 3 subgroups, campaigns labeled by the actual consumer as either having too little branding, just enough branding, or too much branding, those that had too much branding not only had the best user experience, but it also drove percentages of affinity, interest in learning more, and again, that purchase consideration higher than the other 2 groups, and all at statistically significant levels. But again, the important thing to remember here is that the content has to be good. It has to resonate with the consumer. And so that's something that we wanted to understand a bit further. What are the motivations of the consumer? What's the mindset that they're in? So we wanted to take this research, and again, because we had these normative databases, but we wanted to understand the why. Why do people use content? Why are they engaging with content in the first place? So similar to our custom effectiveness, we wanted to look around and see what was currently out there, what was currently backed by data. But we found that there really wasn't any methodology. So again, we took it upon ourselves to create our own, something that could be really actionable for our clients when creating content. And we decided to do a content moment segmentation, also known as an occasion-based segmentation. And we did this because when you do a conventional segmentation, you're really putting a consumer in one box. And when people are consuming content online, they don't always fit into one place. That's an oversimplification. If you think about your own digital content consumption, sometimes you're doing research, sometimes you're trying to entertain yourself, and not to mention that this differs across all various categories. So we thought it was important to do a moments-based segmentation because that allowed us to understand the nuances of digital content consumption. And I'm sure everyone in here is familiar with segmentation on some level, but what was interesting about this was that we didn't know what variables we wanted to use going into the segmentation. Instead, we let the data speak for themselves. And we found that there are 4 variables that we use to segment. So the first, we looked at the motivations. What did consumers want to get out of the content? Next was emotions. How did they feel during the content experience? Next was outcomes. What were they primed to do after consuming that content? And of course, topics. What actual content type or topic were they consuming? And we learned that there were 8 different types of content moments based on those 4 variables that I just spoke about. And each of these have different nuances based on those 4 variables. So let's go into each one of these at a very high overall level. So the first one is inspire. The motivation is to gain fresh ideas. Consumers feel relaxed and inspired. And the outcome is that they're primed for further action. And this could be either offline or online. Next is feel good. This is a very fuzzy and heartwarming experience. Consumers feel happy and relaxed. And I should mention that this is all about the individual. So for me, again, if I see like a funny pet video, that's going to make me feel good regardless of where I am in my current scenario. But it's all about the individual, so it's really to each their own on this. Next is entertain. So really how it already sounds is consumers are looking for an amusing escape. They feel relaxed and happy, and the importance is that they're feeling replenished post-engagement. Our fourth moment is update socially. And this is not what you think it might be, where it's just simply going on a social platform and just updating your status, but instead actually going to your network and understanding what's trending, understanding what's important to your friends and family. People are feeling relaxed and happy, and they really want to feel a reset after a mental break. Next is find. This is our most practical of all of our moments. Consumers want answers to their questions, they're feeling focused, they're feeling motivated, and they come out ready to act. In here, this would be like your online research. So say you're buying a new car, you're taking a trip, you want to understand what's the best for you. Next is be in the know. Consumers want to be updated, they're feeling relaxed and focused, but I should point out that they can also feel frustrated. And they feel frustrated when there's repetition in content. So they want to be armed with information coming out of this moment, but if they're seeing the same content over and over again, then it's not getting them to their motivation of being updated. Next is connect. This is a very visual and buzzy moment, so it's typically video or slideshows. And consumers are feeling happy and excited, and they come out of it entertained, and they're ready to share with their social network. And lastly is comfort. Consumers are trying to gain understanding and support because they feel frustrated and anxious. So maybe it's a consumer that got some bad news, maybe financially or medically, and they go online because they want to understand, are others feeling this same way? How did they react to this diagnosis or this negative news? And when they come out of it, they feel understood and they've gained personal insight. We actually call this the digital hug. So that's just going over the 8 at a high level. And so you might say, is there one moment that really sticks out? Well, I find when we look at this in this quad chart, when we look at practical versus emotional and lean back versus lean forward behaviors, we learn 2 main things. The first thing is that there are nuances to each of these. I know I went over these at a very high level, but you might think, well, this one sounded like that one, feel good sounded like entertain, but it's important to, again, look at the nuances. So if we look at those 2 on the lean forward and the lean back, we see that there's differences like feel good is very lean forward. So remember I mentioned that the funny pet videos work for me. I know what's gonna make me feel good, so I seek out that information. But with entertain, it's very lean back. It's more passive. So the consumer might be just, say, looking at music videos or doing some research about their favorite band or genre. It's way more passive and they're not seeking out the particular information. And the second thing, you might think, well, is there one moment that trumps all the others? And Inspire in the top right corner, yes, has 20%, has the largest percentage, but that's only 20%. So that really allows us to see the nuances between the different moments. And I understand with advertising, some brands might come and say, I really want to focus on Inspire, and that might make sense for traditional paid advertising because that's reinforcing the same brand or the same message. But what we've learned with content is that you can't just focus on one moment. You need to include all of the moments, because if you focus on one, even Inspire at 20%, there's still 80% of moments that you might be missing out. So you need to cast a large net in order to make sure you're reaching your consumers in all the moments. And so how do these moments vary even further? So if we look at this by category, I know it's a lot of numbers, so just bear with me on this slide, but we can see all the different topics and we see all the moments going across. And so when we look at the blue boxes, we see which moments hit the most in different categories. And it's important to not only create content around a category, but it's also important to create it around the moment. When we look at Inspire and Be in the Know, those first 2 columns, we see fashion, food, travel, even autos pop for Inspire. But when we go to the right, no one is Be in the Know when it comes to those topics. But not surprisingly, when we look at politics, almost half are in that Be in the Know and no one is in that Inspire moment. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're creating that relevant content. Not surprising, right? And then even taking this a little bit further is it's important to understand this by device. because it's important to understand how consumers are going to be engaging with your content, because it does change depending on the device. So when we look at desktop, that tends to be way more practical. Those find that be in the know, and that could just be because of the amount of time that consumers are on this device naturally throughout the day, but it also could be how complicated the activities they're doing on that device. So again, like find and be in the know, that's more researching. So maybe they're comparing and contrasting a car, or they're buying a house. They want to do this on a bigger screen where they can actually do their research. But when we look at mobile and tablet, that's more social, that's more emotional. So that update socially, that inspire. And lastly, gaming. That's way more lean forward, that connect, that comfort, that feel good. And while all this was based on the US, when we did this update over the summer, we also looked at different countries. So how does this differ when we look at this internationally? And so just to point out for US, they over-index on more of those emotional motivations. So things like comfort and connect. But again, when we looked at this internationally, we saw some interesting differences. So when we looked at Germany, we saw that they popped more on those practical outcomes, that blew 17%. And what was interesting was Japan, at almost a third, popped on that inspire. So it's important that when we're creating content, we're not just translating it, but instead we're creating content based on the country that we're targeting. So I hope that you can understand, now that we've gone through each of these moments in different ways, why it's important to connect with consumers in the different moments. Because if you just focus on one moment, you might be not reaching all of your target, or you might be missing your target completely. So it's important to include more than one moment when you're doing content creation. And so just 3 takeaways for marketers. Just like I said, it's important to take that portfolio approach. So what we mean by that is it's important to diversify. It's important to include all 8 of those moments, because everyone is different. There's nuances to digital consumption. Next, it's important to match those moments and test the content for resonance with your target audience. And again, just think back to that dog food example. It's not only about your target from an age, gender skew, but it's actually understanding what environment works for them. And if you can do it in the pre-testing phase, it's even better, because that just gives you more knowledge ahead of launch. And lastly, align your KPIs and goals with the program objectives and develop that measurement plan accordingly. So use that framework that we suggested for that custom effectiveness to really see if the content program is going to work. And so I just want to point that out when you get this presentation. We have a link down here for our content moments. I know that we mentioned 3 of the countries, but we did 5 other countries internationally, so feel free to go and check that out. So thank you. If you have any questions, or I'll be around today.
So do we have any quick questions for Amelia from the group? Yes? Jens is saving me the honor of running to you.
Did you do any testing of this with B2B brands?
We didn't. We did not do that. But we roll this out every couple of years, so we're going to be included. And we were also asked at another conference about doing it with kids and teens, so that would be a different thing to do, especially with the update socially and connect. We might see differences, nuances for millennials.
Now, I'm wondering even of the whole structure, the 8 moments change based on those audiences, either B2B or age group.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Don't forget to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Karen Lynch. So the question I have is about some of the analytical information kind of the data that brought you to understanding those moments. Where's the overlay with qualitative, if you don't mind sharing that?
Sure. So it was the way that we did the qualitative approach to it was everyone was consuming the content, and they were able to say, well, what type of moment did they feel that they were in? So it was important for us to understand, okay, well, you're in your connect moment, you're in your comfort moment, you're in your find moment. So we not only passively understood where they were, but we then followed up with a survey to understand, well, what was that moment and how would you define that moment? Because we also looked at it, again, across all of those categories.
Do you find that it's possible for content to touch on more than one of those moments, either via different execution strategies or the content itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I think something that we found really interesting was in the finance category was that, you think maybe bank would only do find because that's really practical, but there's so much part of comfort in finance because people are unsure about how their finance affects their credit or could they own a home. So there's content that can really fit within like, okay, this is how you might fix your credit score, but it's okay if you have a bad one because we can work on this together. So it definitely can go into multiple buckets of them.